Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron were spawned from the same parent company, the Standard Oil Company, which also propagated 4 other sister companies, Gulf, Texaco, BP, and Shell. The father whose sperm fertilized this egg of corruption, fraud, and venality was John D. Rockefeller, who was told by his father, "My son, don't ever trust anyone, not even me." Rockefeller made his initial fortune from kerosene, not gasoline. That all changed when Ford introduced his Model T in 1908. Gasoline, a byproduct of refining kerosene, was dumped into rivers and lakes at night when Rockefeller couldn't sell his gasoline for at least a penny a gallon. In 1859, Colonel Drake drilled the United States' first oil well at Titusville, Pennsylvania. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller formed the Standard Oil Company. In 1908, Ford introduced the Model T. Cost $875. You had the choice of one color, black. In 1911, the Standard Oil Trust morphed into a family trust consisting of the 7 sisters: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Gulf, Texaco, BP, and Shell, all part of the same household. Also in 1911, Winston Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty, replacing Fisher, who was known as the godfather of oil for powering Great Britain's fleet. In June 1912, Churchill wrote, "My dear Mr. Fisher, you have got to find the oil. To show how it can be stored cheaply, how it can be purchased regularly and cheaply in peace, and with absolute certainty in war." End quote. World War I, also known as the Great War, was a global war originating in Europe that lasted from 28 July 1914 to 11 November 1918. In 1914, the British government acquired a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company with a separate contract that allowed them to share in the profits and allowed them to assign 2 members to the board of directors. In 1924, the Teapot Dome scandal erupted in the United States. On July 31, 1928, the Red Line Agreement was signed. Within the bounds of that red line, none of the companies could engage in any oil business except through their common monopoly. In 1933, Standard Oil of California won the oil concession to all of Saudi Arabia's oil. In 1934, Gulf Oil and Anglo-Iranian gained a joint oil concession in Kuwait. In 1936, Hitler developed a major synthetic fuels program to power his military in pursuit of Middle East and Caspian oil reserves during World War II. In 1937, Japan began its march towards Indonesia to capture and claim its oil reserves during World War II. In 1938, Mexico nationalized foreign oil companies. During the course of World War II, American oil companies requested that Bechtel develop their Middle East oil resources. To prevent Germany and Japan from gaining access to its claimed oil reserves, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States joined together as allies during World War II. Hitler's plans may have been fueled by hate, but his tanks, trucks, automobiles, warships, submarines, and airplanes were fueled by octane, and the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union fought against Hitler to prevent this from happening. In 1947, the Marshall Plan for Western Europe was fueled with Middle East oil. In 1948, Standard of New Jersey, Exxon, and Secord Vacuum, Mobil, joined Standard of California, Chevron, and Texaco in Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company. In 1949, the Soviet Union inaugurated the world's first offshore oil platform, and in 1955 began a major oil export campaign. In 1956, Egypt took control of the Suez Canal. In 1967, the Six-Day War closed the Suez Canal. In 1973, Saudi Arabia embargoed oil to the United States. Between 1979 and the end of 1985, the United States had to deal with two independent hostage crises. After 444 days of captivity, the American hostages in Iran were released on January 20th, 1981. Shortly after 3 a.m. Washington time, on November 4th, 1979, Ann Swift, the political officer in the United States Embassy in Tehran, announced, "We're going down." In June 1982, Margaret Thatcher, on her way to visit Hong Kong, altered her itinerary and made an appearance in Baku, where Azeri officials beamed as she presented them with a check for $30 million upfront money that sealed the deal for BP. On March 30th, 1983, President Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive NSDD 87, Comprehensive U.S. Energy Security Policy, which the U.S. government kept top secret for 25 years. On April 18, 1983, a suicide bomber in a pickup truck loaded with explosives rammed into the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. 63 people were killed, including 17 Americans, 8 of whom were employed by the Central Intelligence Agency, including Chief Middle East Analyst Robert C. Ames and Station Chief Kenneth Hawes. On September 1, 1983, civilian Korean Airlines Flight 007 with 269 passengers, including U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald, was shot down by Soviet interceptor aircraft. On October 23, 1983, a suicide bomber drove a truck loaded with the equivalent of 6 tons of TNT down the airport road in Beirut, Lebanon. The truck plowed into the 4-story barracks occupied by more than 300 sleeping U.S. troops that were part of a UN peacekeeping mission. The FBI called it the largest non-nuclear bomb in history. The explosion and fireball pulverized the concrete fortress, killing 241 U.S. service members, most of them Marines. A second blast, minutes later, at the compound of the French peacekeeping force killed 58 more Western troops. 3 months later, President Ronald Reagan pulled American troops out of Beirut. On November 10, 1983, 20 minutes after breakfast, Leonid Brezhnev headed up to his bedroom. His protectors followed him in and closed the door. Brezhnev left the room a dead man. 5 days after Brezhnev's death, the head of the KGB, Yuri Vladimirovich Nadropov, became the new captain of the Soviet ship of state. Nadropov hand-picked Brezhnev's bodyguards. On December 12, 1983, the American embassy in Kuwait was bombed. Other targets included the French embassy, the control tower at the airport, the country's main oil refinery, and a residential area for employees of the American corporation Raytheon. 6 people were killed. More than 80 others were injured. The suspects were thought to be members of Al-Dawa, or the Call, an Iranian-backed group and one of the principal Shiite groups operating against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In Kuwait, 17 people were arrested and convicted for participating in the attacks. General Akhtar needed sniper rifles, packages, so the Mujahideen could target Soviet commanders and generals. The CIA knew the location of the homes and officers of the leading Soviet generals. The CIA tracked their movements. Hitting them would be merely a formality. All that was needed was to get the proper military hardware into the hands of General Akhtar. CIA Director William Casey liked the idea, but it was an awkward, tricky, difficult, delicate matter to deal with because the guns would be used for assassination, and there was a presidential order prohibiting the U.S. government from involvement in the assassination of foreign officials. So Casey took the complex matter to the CIA lawyers for a ruling. Because the stench of assassination was strong, The lawyers balked. Casey boomed. What's the difference between supplying rockets to kill officers on the battlefield and supplying these rifles? The lawyers told Casey the difference was intent. If the rifles were provided with the intent of killing Soviet generals, Casey would be violating the presidential directive on assassination and could go to jail. Casey waved off their concerns and told them, if anyone asks, don't tell them these are sniper rifles to be used for assassination. Tell them they are hunting rifles. That is our intent. What they choose to hunt is their decision, not ours. Approximately 100 hunting rifles were delivered to General Akhtar, and the Mujahideen trained in their use. On March 7, 1984, Jerry Levin is kidnapped in Lebanon, the first of the so-called forgotten American hostages. Levin spent 11.5 months chained to a wall in solitary confinement. On March 16, 1984, William Buckley, the CIA station chief in Beirut, was kidnapped by Shiite Islamist militants belonging to the then embryonic Hezbollah. Associated Press Bureau Chief Terry Anderson, who would himself be taken hostage a year later, wrote about his time of confinement in Den of Lions. He would write, the Hezbollah operation against Buckley was almost a model of counter-espionage. Buckley had developed a friendship with a woman Shiite agent named Zenub, sister of the woman involved in the assassination of American University President Kerr. Unknown to him, she was a double, a responsible, or official in Hezbollah whose true loyalty was with the fundamentalist party. According to one usually reliable source, Buckley grew enamored of the woman and began an affair with her. Later, the CIA man began to grow suspicious. Because the woman had access to his apartment, the kidnapping was easy. The decision to take him was made on Friday, March 15, 1984. On March 16, in an operation involving 12 cars full of Hezbollah agents, he was snatched. Buckley was repeatedly and severely tortured over the next 10 months, which broke his health and led directly to his death. Buckley's captors said they executed him on October 1, 1985, in retaliation for an Israeli raid on Palestinian targets in Tunisia. The New York Times reported in December 1991 that it was shortly after Mr. Buckley's killing in 1985 that President Ronald Reagan made the release of 5 other American hostages then being held in Lebanon a top national priority. This decision led to a series of covert operations that culminated in the Iran-Contra affair. On April 6, 1984, the Wall Street Journal reported that the CIA was mining Nicaraguan harbors. Mining harbors is generally considered under international law as the equivalent to imposing a blockade, which is regarded as an act of war. The U.S. had kept its involvement in the mining of Nicaraguan harbors a secret. In May 1984, Duane Clarridge, a CIA officer who had cultivated contacts with the Nicaraguan rebels, introduced National Security Council staffer Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North to the leaders of the Nicaraguan Contras currently operating out of Honduras. Clarridge told the Contra leaders that if Congress cuts off aid to the Contras in light of the recent revelations that the CIA mined the Nicaraguan harbor, Oliver North would continue working with them on a covert basis. Saudi Arabia agreed to contribute $1 million per month for the Contras. On May 8, 1984, Benjamin Ware, who with his wife Carol served as missionaries in Lebanon with the Presbyterian Church USA for nearly 30 years, were kidnapped off the streets of Beirut. The kidnapping was done by the Islamic fundamentalist group Islamic Jihad, which later evolved into Hezbollah. He was freed 16 months later in exchange for U.S. anti-tank weapons as part of the Iran-Contra affair. In May 1984, the Saudis were being encircled by the Soviet Union. There were an estimated 1,500 Soviet military advisors in South Yemen, 500 in North Yemen, 2,500 in Syria, 1,000 in Ethiopia, and 1,000 in Iraq. With almost 10,000 Soviet troops in Afghanistan, the Saudis expected a Soviet thrust into the Persian Gulf. At the time, Saudi Arabia had an overabundance of 2 to 3 million barrels of oil that could be dumped onto world markets with the turn of a valve. On June 25, 1984, the U.S. Congress rejected Contra aid. In July 1984, Richard Secord and Oliver North set up private arms sales to the Contras. On September 2, 1984, the Contras lost their only helicopter in the Northern Front. On September 15, 1984, the CIA transferred a replacement to the Contras. On September 20, 1984, in Akkar, northeast of Beirut, a truck bomb exploded outside the U.S. Embassy Annex, killing 24 people, including 2 U.S. military personnel. According to the U.S. State Department's 1999 report on terrorist organizations, elements of Hezbollah were known or suspected to have been involved in the bombing. On November 8, 1984, Congress banned Contra aid. The White House decided that the ban did not apply to the NSC. On December 3, 1984, Kuwait Airways Flight 221, on its way from Kuwait to Pakistan, was hijacked and diverted to Tehran. The hijackers demanded the release of the Kuwait 17. When their demands were not met, the hijackers killed 2 American officials from the U.S. Agency for International Development. On the 6th day of the drama, Iranian security forces stormed the plane and released the remaining hostages. They arrested the hijackers and informed the world that everyone would be brought to trial. The trial never took place, and the hijackers were allowed to leave the country. The State Department announced a $250,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of those involved in the hijacking. On December 21st, 1984, Donald Gregg, Vice President Reagan's National Security and Foreign Policy Advisor, one of the architects of the secret plan to fund the Nicaraguan Contras, introduced his partner, Felix Rodriguez, to Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the National Security Council, the lead in the NSC's Contra resupply and funding operation. On January 8, 1985, Reverend Lawrence Jenko was kidnapped in Lebanon. On February 14, 1985, Jerry Levin escaped from his kidnappers. On March 16, 1985, Terry Anderson was kidnapped in Beirut. Head of American University of Beirut Medical Center, David Jacobson was kidnapped on May 28, 1985, by Shiite Muslims seeking release of terrorists imprisoned in Kuwait. Blindfolded, chained, beaten, and threatened with death, he and 5 others were locked in a small room. On June 3, 1985, William Buckley died in captivity. On June 7, 1985, Oliver North asked for money to ransom 2 of the hostages. Ross Perot provided the funding. On June 9, 1985, Thomas Sutherland was kidnapped in Beirut. On June 12, 1985, the House reversed its previous vote and passed Contra aid. On June 14, 1985, TWA Flight 847, traveling from Athens to Rome, was hijacked and forced to land in Beirut, Lebanon. The hijackers held the plane in Beirut for 17 days. The hijackers demanded the release of the Kuwait 17, as well as the release of 700 fellow Shiite Muslim prisoners held in Israeli prisons, including prisons in southern Lebanon run by the Israeli-backed South Lebanon Army. When their demands were not met, they shot Robert Dean Stetham, a U.S. Navy diver, and dumped his body onto the airport tarmac. After Stethem's death, hostages started being released. U.S. officials denied there was any deal, but on June 19, 1985, Iran sent a message saying they wanted to help with the TWA hijacking. David KIMCHE, the Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry, met secretly with National Security Advisor Robert McFarland. KIMCHE advised McFarland that Israel may be able to use its influence with Iran to engineer the release of American hostages currently held by Hezbollah. KIMCHE's outreach was the final piece in the complex arms for hostages deal between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. On June 30th, 1985, the TWA hostages were released. On July 8, 1985, President Ronald Reagan spoke before American Bar Association and said that Iran was part of a confederation of terrorist states and said that America will never make concessions to terrorists. On July 11, 1985, An arms for hostage swap is proposed by Israel. On August 15, 1985, Contra aid was resumed. On August 30, 1985, Israel transferred 100 TOW missiles to Iran. 2 weeks later, the first American hostage was released. On September 14, 1985, an additional 408 TOW missiles were sent to Iran. On September 20, 1985, Oliver North told Felix Rodriguez that 2 planes were being sent to the Contras. Rodriguez helped divert funds and weapons to the Nicaraguan Contras. On October 7, 1985, 4 gunmen hijacked the Italian cruise ship Achille Lauro off the coast of Egypt and demanded the release of Palestinian prisoners in Egypt, Italy, and elsewhere. When the demands were not met, they killed Leon Klinghoffer, a 69-year-old disabled American tourist. After the hijackers departed the Achille Lauro, they left Egypt by air. U.S. Navy fighters intercepted the plane and forced it down in Italy. The 4 hijackers were apprehended. In 1986, they were found guilty in an Italian court. 2 of the hijackers escaped from prison. One, Majid al-Molgi, who confessed to killing Mr. Klinghoffer, was caught and returned to prison. The man identified as the mastermind of the hijacking, Abu Abbas, was released by Italy despite Washington's plea that he be held for trial. On November 14, 1985, Terry Waite reported that the kidnappers were under pressure and may kill hostages. On November 17, 1985, Oliver North was put in charge of the upcoming shipment of U.S. Hawk anti-aircraft missiles to Khomeini in Iran for use against Iraq. Between November 22nd and November 25th, 1985, 2 separate shipments of Hawk missiles were flown to Iran. Both were rejected and returned. In late 1985, Assistant Secretary of State ELLIOT Abrams joined the National Security Council as one of the principal members of a restricted interagency group which worked on Central American affairs for the Reagan administration. Abrams became aware of North's using the profits from the sale of the TOW missiles to Khomeini for funding the Contras in spite of Congress's prohibition on such expenditures. Abrams became directly involved in a secret, illegal effort to secure funding for the Contras from other nations. On December 5, 1985, President Reagan secretly signed a presidential finding authorizing the Iran Arms for Hostages program. Also on December 5, 1985, Oliver North outlined a plan to sell an additional 3,300 TOW missiles and 50 improved Hawk missiles to Iran in exchange for the release of all hostages and 1 French hostage. On December 7, 1985, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger wrote himself a note about Reagan saying, quote, "He could answer charges of illegality, but he couldn't answer a charge that big, strong President Reagan passed up a chance to free hostages." On December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 from London to New York exploded over the small town of Larkabie, Scotland. All 259 people on board were killed, along with 11 on the ground. According to the State Department's Patterns of Global Terrorism 1991, released in April 1992, the bombing of Pan Am 103, quote, was an action authorized by the Libyan government, end quote. Though there were reports that Syria and Iran also played significant roles in the attack, U.S. officials were never able to tie the two countries to the bombing. No one has ever taken credit for planting the bomb. On March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez spilled 11 million gallons of crude oil into Alaska's Prince William Sound. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. On August 2, 1990, Iraq started its invasion of Kuwait. The UN imposed an embargo on Iraq's oil, and a multinational force was dispatched to Iraq to regain control of Iraq and Kuwait's oil. On January 15, 1991, as Iraqi forces withdrew from Kuwait, they set fire to over 650 oil wells and damaged almost 75 more, which then spewed crude oil across the desert and into the Persian Gulf. The fires burned for 10 months. According to a study published in Disaster Prevention and Management, firefighting crews from 10 countries, part of a response team that comprised approximately 11,450 workers from 38 countries, used familiar and also never before tested technologies to put out the fires. When the last fire was extinguished in November, about 300 lakes of oil remained, as well as a layer of soot and oil that fell out of the sky and mixed with sand and gravel to form Tar Creek, not concrete, but Tar Creek, across 5% of Kuwait's landscape. In July 1991, Ken Deere, chairman of Chevron, stopped by the White House for a 15-minute photo opportunity and a brief chance to get Elder Bush up to date on Tengiz, a Kazakhstan oil field containing 14 billion barrels of oil that BP also wanted. President Bush expanded on Deere's suggestion by saying, "I would love to talk to you about your negotiations with the Soviets. Are you free for lunch today?" The Chevron boss recalled the president saying. "Then," said Deere, "he called Scowcroft, and the three of us went down to the White House mess, as they call it, and I sat there for an hour and a half and went through the whole deal, where we were and what we needed." On December 16, 1991, President Nazarbayev, the last leader of the 15 constituent republics to abandon the Soviet Union, declared Kazakhstan to be an independent state. 10 days later, the Soviet Union officially perished. On September 20th, 1994, Heydar Aliyev of Azerbaijan signed the contract of a century. Flanking him were oil company executives and government officials from the United States, Britain, and Russia. A deputy energy minister initialed the document as a witness. The Azeri government interpreted his action as a signal that Moscow agreed that this oil field belonged to Azerbaijan. Just how wrong he was became clear when he was told by the Russian Foreign Ministry that Moscow abhorred unilateral actions that contradicted international law, stating that Moscow did not recognize the deal. 6 days later, Aliyev and President Clinton sat in two large armchairs at New York's Waldorf Astoria when Aliyev requested a favor. Could Clinton try to persuade Russia's Boris Yeltsin to acquiesce to the oil deal? Clinton promised he would. On September 28, 1994, President Clinton and Vice President Al Gore met with Yeltsin. Clinton gently argued that, quote, oil development in this region is good for Russia and good for the U.S. He also told the Russian president that, quote, it's in your interest to take another look at this and show a little flexibility, end quote. Vice President Gore was a bit more blunt, telling Yeltsin, quote, you guys will get a 10% cut. That's not such a bad deal. And it's a way to get Azerbaijan off the Russian dole. On Christmas Eve, 1992, President Bush issued a presidential pardon to all indicted in the Iran-Contra affair when his father was vice president under Ronald Reagan. When Putin took over as prime minister in August 1999, the capitalized value of the country's publicly traded stocks amounted to $74 billion. In 2006, Russia took over Saudi Arabia's title as the world's largest producer of crude oil. By the end of 2006, the capitalized value of Russia's publicly traded stocks exceeded $1 trillion. It has always been about oil, politics, and power.